Alrighty, I'm going to record this as pod number 13. This is again going to be on Plato's Euthyphro. Currently playing in the background is actually one of my setlist videos while it's premiering, which I've never done this before. In case you don't quite understand what that noise is in the background when I'm doing these pods, yes, it is my own music and it's playing in the background because it entertains me and keeps me from getting bored, I guess, through this process. But anyway, so yesterday I did the pod on the beginning of Plato's Euthyphro, and I thought I did a good job within the first essentially 3.5 pages of content in this 10 to 15 page dialogue, starting to get some of the ideas out there as far as Socratic irony, epistemic ignorance, Socrates' sort of positions on things, his method, dialectic, some of these other things. So at this point, I'm going to sort of pick up where I left off and start again in the next paragraph after the previous paragraph where Euthyphro says I'd be no use at all, Socrates, and Euthyphro would be no different from the majority of people if I didn't have exact knowledge of all such things, meaning the positions the gods take and about the pious and the impious. So Socrates then continues, so my excellent Euthyphro, the best thing it seems for me is to become your student and to challenge Miletus on the very point before his case comes to trial, telling him that even in the past I always considered it of great importance to know about religious matters, and that now, when he says I've done wrong through improvising and innovating concerning the gods, I've become your student. Shouldn't I say to him, Miletus, if you agree that Euthyphro is wise about the gods, you should also regard me as correctly acknowledging them and drop the charge. But if you don't agree, prosecute this teacher of mine rather than me for corrupting the old men, myself and his own father, me by his teaching and his father by admonishment and punishment. If he isn't convinced by me and doesn't drop the charge or prosecute you instead of me, shouldn't I say the same things in court as in my challenge to him? So this is another section where I have a bit of an LOL at the part where Socrates essentially turns his charge on Euthyphro, and I think this is where the Socratic irony and the sarcasm really comes through, where Socrates is essentially joking with him, being like, well, I want to become your student, and if I'm your student and, he's still going to prosecute me, at least I know we're in this together and I'm taking you down with me, essentially. So it's a really clever, interesting thing for Socrates to say. And so he says this, and then Euthyphro's response is, yes, by Zeus, Socrates, and if he tried bringing an indictment against me, I think I'd soon find his weak points, and the question in court would very quickly be about him rather than me. So this is a change of the subject argument, and it's classic sort of logical fallacy ad hominem, essentially, but also I have written here as a note, Euthyphro is such a liberal Chad for some reason, but he definitely sounds like he could be on fucking MSNBC for sure. But that notwithstanding, Euthyphro is basically, he's flying his colors here in terms of, again, he doesn't care about facts as much as he does about finding weak spots. And so when he said earlier that he has, exact knowledge about the positions the gods take, about the pious and the impious, Socrates is about to not exactly tear this guy down, but he's certainly going to he's gonna take this guy and make his opinions appear a bit unfounded, and he's definitely going to confuse him and fluster him over the course of the rest of this dialogue. So Socrates says, I realize that as well as you do, my dear friend, and that's why I'm eager to become your student. I know that this Miletus, as well as others, no doubt, pretends not to notice you at all, whereas he has seen me so sharply and so easily that he has indicted me for impiety. This is a little joke from Socrates here, pointing out that basically Euthyphro is a relatively unknown figure, whereas Socrates is, relatively speaking, a decently famous person, at least within the city. There's a lot of people who know of him, who've seen him so sharply. So Socrates then says, now then, in the name of Zeus, tell me what you were just claiming to know so clearly. What sort of thing would you say the holy and the unholy are, whether in cases of murder or anything else? Or isn't the pious itself the same as itself in every action? And conversely, isn't the impious entirely the opposite of the pious? And whatever is going to count as impious, isn't it itself similar to itself? Doesn't it, as regards impiety, possess one single characteristic? So this paragraph here is a good articulation of the Platonic method as far as just the way that Socrates and Plato through Socrates likes to get to definitions, especially at the beginning in these sort of earlier dialogues. But so, talking about the thing itself, the same as itself in every action, the opposite of its opposites, and whatever is going to count as the impious, isn't it itself similar to itself? Doesn't it, as regard impiety, possess one single characteristic? So this is going to lead into what people refer to as the theory of the forms. But essentially, when you think about the theory of the forms, you can get a little bit distracted almost by the wordplay of the term form in English. Doesn't really translate the way we would, the way that it should, because the term in Greek apparently is idea or ideia. So if we thought of Plato's theory of the forms as Plato's theory of ideas, it might seem a little different to people, but that notwithstanding, again, looking for these one single characteristics, and then we'll see through the definitions that are given, and then the definitions that are subsequently rejected for a variety of reasons, and then the eventual definition, the sort of the traditional, what's referred to as the horns argument of the sort of two sides of what could possibly be the sort of definitions of piety, are offered at a certain point. But like most things in most Platonic dialogues, most ideas end up getting shot down because they reveal some sort of logical inconsistency of their consequences, or whatever it happens to be. So we can continue to roll through this, but this is just good to see that this is what the Socratic method is. So Euthyphro, absolutely Socrates, and one thing here is Euthyphro is not the greatest interlocutor that Plato ever wrote. He's also not the worst. He certainly has some creative ideas and things that he says, but there's a weird sort of element to Platonic philosophy and the dialectic where you could say the conversations that occur are slightly inorganic, in the sense that they often revolve around one person talking for the vast majority of the time, and then just asking little questions to make sure their interlocutor is going along for the ride. Blah blah blah. Don't you agree? Xenophon or whatever. Oh, absolutely, Socrates. So that's just to put that out there really quickly. But then Socrates says, tell me then, what do you say the pious and the impious are? Euthyphro, very well. I say what's pious is precisely what I'm doing now, prosecuting those who commit an injustice such as murder or temple robbery, or those who've done some other wrong, regardless of whether they're one's father or one's mother or anyone else whatever. Not prosecuting them, on the other hand, is what's impious. So I have a note here at the top of this page which says bad argument, what's pious is what I'm doing. Better argument was pious is what I feel I should do. to ensure justice, so that's sort of my note there. But you can sort of obviously see in this paragraph that this is literally a self-serving definition, as in Euthyphro has defined piety in terms of his own actions, which anybody giving a proper definition that Socrates wants will not do this, but Euthyphro is sort of early on in his tutelage from Socrates, and he's going to learn today, so we're going to continue to roll along, but just to go over some of the elements here from Euthyphro's definition, because it's not the worst definition of all time. But so the pious is prosecuting committers of injustice, including murder, temple robbery, people who do wrong things, essentially. And then this other element is regardless of familial ties or any sort of ties whatsoever, and that not doing these things is impious, on the contrary. So then to keep rolling along with Euthyphro, why Socrates, look at the powerful evidence I have that the law requires this. Evidence I've already offered to show other people that such actions are right, that one must not let an impious person go, no matter who he may happen to be. You see, those very people acknowledge Zeus as the best and most just of gods, and yet they agree that he put his own father in fetters because he unjustly swallowed down his children, that he, in his turn, castrated his father because of other similar injustices, yet they're extremely angry with me because I'm prosecuting my father for his injustice, and so they contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and about me. So this is a very, very funny paragraph here where I have another note which says, appeal to the divine / Hesiod, and something, oh yeah, y'all religion dumb as fuck. That's my note. So I think what we can see here, and this is something I said sort of in the Iliad Odyssey pod earlier, but whatever you think of Hesiod and Homer and all these people, the one thing you can't say is that they were insignificant in their time. And these people, their mind frames are shaped by these stories. Arguably, these stories are a reflection of the sort of psyche of society sort of writ large. But to go through some of these elements of what Euthyphro claims is powerful evidence, what he's essentially doing here is he cites precedent. So he talks about evidence I've offered. Can't let an impious person go. Zeus is the best and most just of gods. He put his own father in fetters, i.e. Zeus basically sliced up his father Kronos with his father Kronos' sickle, which his father Kronos used to castrate his father Uranus because of other similar injustices, which we're not going to get into that because it's frankly weird. But the important point, I guess, to acknowledge at this point is that, number one, we see Euthyphro is talking about acknowledging Zeus as the best and most just of the gods, and so that's an element of his vision of piety and his sort of image of religious ideology in general. And so what this precedent does, at least in Euthyphro's opinion, is it gives him precedent that he is allowed to prosecute his father for injustice, basically because Zeus sliced Kronos into a bajillion pieces, and because Kronos cut Uranus' nuts off. So, when you look at it from what we can call an objective perspective, who's to say there actually is an objective perspective, or from a more objective perspective, this doesn't justify anything that Euthyphro is doing. Euthyphro is finding evidence in support of his beliefs rather than shaping his beliefs around available evidence. But so he acknowledges that people are still angry with them, but he's saying they contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and about me. So in a few strokes, Euthyphro has compared himself to Zeus and Kronos. He's essentially put himself in the analogical position to a god as far as an argument he's making and all these sorts of things. So just keep that in mind when Socrates says what he says next, because it's important to know that Euthyphro, right, he's not the only person with access to this sort of information. There's a lot of people, most of the people in this society believe in this religious framework. Zeus is the head of a polytheistic framework of religion, etc., and all these particulars of especially Hesiod with, the original sky god pissing off Mother Earth giving a sickle to her son Kronos and instructing him to cast down his father, which he does, and then he's cast down in turn, and there's prophecy after prophecy of each one of the major gods is going to be overthrown, including Zeus at the end of the day once he has the male child with Metis, or whatever the situation is. It's stupid, it doesn't matter. But anyway, this is all to say that this is, again, the religious context that I believe that Plato is struggling against, him and Socrates in this, and we're going to see why in this upcoming paragraph. So here, Socrates says, in rejoinder to Euthyphro's definition of piety, could this be the reason, Euthyphro, I face indictment, that when people say such things about the gods, I find them somehow hard to accept? That, it seems, is why some people will say I'm a wrongdoer. But now if you know so much about such matters, share these views, seems that the rest of us must assent to them too. I mean, what can we possibly say in reply when we admit ourselves that we know nothing about them? But tell me, by the God of friendship, do you really believe those stories are true? So, those two of the big quotes that I included from the original podcast where I had the list of quotes, but let's just go over that again. When people say such things about the gods, I find them somehow hard to accept. When we admit ourselves that we know nothing about them, do you really believe those stories are true? So just to go over something, this word story he's using there probably might be the word mythos or something like that, but Socrates is not using the modern term of myth in terms of a sort of a disparaging term, but he is sort of making that point of, do you really believe in these stories? And you might not think of that as a radical statement, and I think it would be open to debate as far as how much something like this truly made Socrates a heretic of sorts within his society. But I think there can be no doubt that this, if Plato is accurately transcribing Socrates' sort of religious ideology, then it certainly seems like Socrates was on a regular basis basically hearing these myths and being like, nah, I can't accept that on faith. And so this is again where you can say with the Socratic irony versus the genuine thing that I talked about last pod, it's like, either the Socratic irony is like really showing itself when he says he finds it hard to accept and believe, and we know nothing about them, etc. But on the other side, he says, it's like if you share these views, it seems the rest of us must assent to them too. So you can almost look at Socrates as he'll always give you the benefit of allowing you to make your conditional proof argument. His only point is if it ends up being an indirect proof argument, if we go from P to Q and we find Q and not Q, then we've derived not P, and Socrates basically just won't let you off on that point, and I think that's a good thing. So Socrates says this, and Euthyphro says, yes, and still more amazing things, Socrates, that the majority of people don't know. So, classic religious person, especially an evangelizer of any kind, everything they say is amazing, everything they say is wonderful, everything they say is special knowledge that the majority of people don't know. So, that's Euthyphro saying that. And Socrates then says to him, and do you believe that there really is war among the gods, and terrible hostilities and battles, and other such things of the sort that the poets relate, and that the painters embroider on our sacred objects, and thinking particularly of the robe covered with embroideries of such scenes as carried up to the Acropolis at the great Panathenæan festival? Or are we to say that those are true, Euthyphro? Not only those, Socrates, but as I mentioned just now, I will, if you like, tell you lots of other things about religious matters that I'm sure you'll be amazed to hear. So, to go over this again, Socrates is starting to poke holes right here at the beginning in the religion of his culture by, again, he's already admitted, I find them somewhat hard to accept, that there really is war among the gods, and terrible hostilities and battles, and other such things that the poets relate. So here we've got the war among the gods element, and that's really relating from the Iliad, from when the gods have their quarrels and struggles, both with mortals and with other immortals, in their various capacities and whatever it is they're trying to accomplish at any given point in time. Terrible hostilities and battles, things in Hesiod as well, and etc. And Socrates is pointing out, the source of this information is usually poetry and painting, and he's really raising the question, are we to say those are true, or are we to potentially say something else about them, sort of implying that he doesn't think that they're true, which is very interesting. But Euthyphro says, again, not only those, Socrates, but as I mentioned just now, I'll tell you lots of other things that I'm sure you'll be amazed to hear. So I think we can just skip on to Socrates' response to that. So Euthyphro assures him that he'll be amazed to hear about all the stupid shit Euthyphro has to say. And Socrates says, I wouldn't be surprised, but tell me about them some other time when we've the leisure. Now, however, try to answer more clearly the question I asked before. You see, my friend, you didn't teach me adequately earlier when I asked what the pious was. But you told me that what you're now doing is pious and prosecuting your father for murder. I'm going to reread that sentence. You see, my friend, you didn't teach me adequately earlier when I asked what the pious was, but you told me that what you're now doing is pious, prosecuting your father for murder. Yes, and what I said was true, Socrates, perhaps, but surely, Euthyphro, there are also many other things you call pious. Yes, indeed. Do you remember them? That what I urged you to do wasn't to teach me about one or two of the many pieties, but rather about the form itself, by virtue of which all of the pieties are pious. You see, you said, I believe, that it was by virtue of one characteristic that the impieties are impious and the pieties pious. Or don't you remember? I do indeed. Then teach me what that characteristic itself is, in order that by concentrating on it and using it as a model, I may call pious any action of yours and anyone else's that is such as it, and may deny to be pious whatever isn't such as it. Euthyphro, if that's what you want, Socrates, that's what I'll tell you. That is what I want, Socrates says. Euthyphro, in that case, what's loved by the gods is pious, and what's not loved by the gods is impious. Let's give Socrates a response. Excellent, Euthyphro. You've now given the sort of answer I was looking for. Whether it's true, however, that I don't know. But clearly you'll go on to demonstrate fully that what you say is true. So I just read a bunch. So again, to go over sort of Socrates' paragraphs, again, you can see Socrates' sarcasm where he says, he's not surprised that Euthyphro has lots of wonderful things to tell him, and but he sort of reminds him, he's like, I'm actually here for a real friggin' reason, so let's not frig around. When we've got the leisure time, we can screw around talking about other shit, but right here and right now, I want you to answer, and I love this sentence right here, try to answer more clearly the very question I asked before. So that's why when I wrote a bunch of notes together, I titled it, this little note section, Answer the Damn Question, Plato's Euthyphro, because I think it's just such a good statement of the Socratic sort of method, dialectic, etc. And he will always insist, essentially, to get the most proper answer to the question. So he essentially points out that, he points out right there and then that Euthyphro has given him an answer about piety that's, only one of the pieties, which is that what Euthyphro is doing is pious, and that, and so again, to reread this sentence, do you remember then that what I urged you to do wasn't to teach me about one or two of the many pieties, but rather about the form itself, by virtue of which all the pieties are impious? And then he reminds Euthyphro that he said it was by virtue of one characteristic that impieties are impious and that pieties are pious. And then teach me what the characteristic itself is, concentrating on it, using it as a model, and then using the definition properly. So that's like a good definition of sort of the Socratic method in general and what it's intended to accomplish in any given case. So that's a lot of the paragraph. And then it's also funny that, Euthyphro's response, again, this character that Plato has created here of Euthyphro is so consistent front to back, where if he's not essentially bloviating and asserting a high-formed opinion that's ultimately incorrect, he will say something along the lines of, if that's what you want, Socrates, then that's what I'll tell you. So it's like he'll basically roll with whatever, because his opinions are relatively nebulous, and he's essentially a dummy who has very bad evidence for the things that he believes. But once again, he's finally gotten at least to a definition that Socrates is at least pleased with for the moment, when he says what's loved by the gods is pious, what's not loved by the gods is impious. So then Socrates says, excellent, Euthyphro, you've now given me the sort of answer I was looking for. Whether it's true, however, that I don't know, but clearly you'll go on to demonstrate fully that what you say is true. So this is another just a wonderful depiction of the philosophical method in general. And again, this is why people say that philosophy really starts with Plato. And if you want to argue with that, I'd just tell you to start reading Plato again and come back and tell me you don't think the same thing. But, when Plato talks about whether it's true, however, that I don't know, clearly you'll go on to demonstrate fully that what you say is true. This is the standard that Plato sets, is whether it's true, I don't know, but we're going to have to demonstrate fully that what people say is true is actually the case, and we'll examine anything people say is true fully, because if we examine it fully and we find that it's not true, that the truth of it is, or the lack of truth of it is revealed in time through examination, that's something that Socrates essentially, he can't abide inconsistent opinions. So then Euthyphro says, Yes, indeed. And then Socrates says, come on then, let's examine what it is we're saying. A God-loved thing or a God-loved person is pious, whereas a God-hated thing or a God-hated person is impious. And the pious isn't the same as the impious, but it's exact opposite. Isn't that what we're saying? So Socrates sometimes gets a little tedious in his language, and I think this is partly a grammatical quirk of ancient Greek, where they didn't quite have proper words to express certain ideas in a simpler way, with clearer language, essentially, but that could be a completely incorrect opinion. But anyway, he will start to talk himself sometimes into these weird sort of circles and almost confuse himself and others with these things. But anyway, so then Socrates says, and does it seem to be true? It does seem so, Socrates, and haven't we also said that the gods quarrel and differ with one another, that there's mutual hostility among them? Indeed, we did say that. Socrates, but what are the issues, my good friend, on which differences produce hostility and anger? Let's examine it this way. If you or I differed about which of two groups was more numerous, would our differences on this issue make us hostile and angry towards one another, or would we turn to calculation and quickly resolve our differences? Of course, that's Euthyphro's line. Socrates. Again, if we differed about which was larger or smaller, we'd turn to measurement and quickly put a stop to our difference. Euthyphro, that's right. Socrates, and we turn to weighing, I imagine, to settle a dispute about which was heavier and lighter. Certainly. Then what sort of issues would make us angry and hostile toward one another if we disagreed about them and were unable to reach a settlement? Perhaps you can't just say offhand, but examine while I'm speaking whether there are issues about the just and unjust, fine and shameful, good and bad. Whenever we become enemies, aren't those issues on which disagreement and an inability to reach settlement make enemies of us, both you and I, and all other human beings? So Socrates is starting to point out, and he starts with a bit of an allusion to mathematics and measurement and calculations and weighing, that he's pointing to the mathematical method to say, if we had a more strictly quantitative question, we would be able to find the quantitative answer, and therefore we need to look for a similar kind of answer, even if it's of a more qualitative variety. We need to look in a way that more resembles mathematical reasoning, because math is sort of the form for Plato of all sort of reasoning. And so Socrates, what he's starting to point out, though, is, if there are issues that make the gods angry and hostile towards one another and they disagree about things, then how could anybody say what the pious is if the gods hate and love different things amongst one another? So that is where I think sort of this fundamental critique of essentially polytheism, although the idea is not really carried through to its logical extent. But I certainly think Plato is starting to make indications along the lines of, I find these stories hard to accept because it's hard to believe they're true. And so, but again, so Euthyphro says that is the difference. Those are the things it has to do with. And then Socrates says, what about the gods, Euthyphro? If indeed they differ, mustn't it be about those same things? Euthyphro says, absolutely. And I have a little note to the side of that which says, why though, you're dumb. It's essentially, Euthyphro starts going along with certain propositions of Socrates that he shouldn't necessarily give up the game like this, but he's too dumb to know what he's talking about. So then Socrates says, then, according to your account, my noble Euthyphro, different sets of gods, too, considering different things to be just or fine or shameful or good or bad. For if they didn't differ about these, they wouldn't quarrel, would they? So this, again, is where I think Plato is really setting out through Socrates this theory of the incompatibility of polytheism with what I would consider to be kind of objectivistic ethics, which is to say that there's kind of that there is a right and a wrong, that it's not all, everything's relative, man, that there really is objective ethics in the world in terms of, Euthyphro is or is not doing the right thing in his circumstance. Socrates has or has not done the right thing. Murder and rape are or are not wrong. These sorts of questions. And Socrates is basically demonstrating, very interestingly, the fact that polytheism, generally speaking, would seem incompatible with having an ethics that was more objectivistic as opposed to relativistic. So that's just something to consider, and Euthyphro goes along with that. He says, that's right. Socrates, then, are the very things that each group of them regards as fine, good, and just also the ones they love, and are the opposite of these the ones they hate? But the very same ones you say that some gods consider to be just and others unjust are also the ones that lead them to quarrel and war with one another when they have disputes about them. Isn't that right? It is. Then the same things, it seemed, are both hated and loved by the gods, and so the same things would seem to be God-hated and God-loved. Euthyphro, it seems that way. Socrates, so on your account, Euthyphro, the same things would be both pious and impious. Euthyphro says, apparently. Socrates then responds, so you haven't answered my question, my excellent friend. You see, I wasn't asking you what the self-same thing is that's both pious and impious, but a thing that's God-loved is, it seems, also God-hated. It follows, Euthyphro, that it would not be surprising at all if what you're doing now is prosecuting your father was something pleasing to Zeus, but displeasing to Kronos and Uranus, or lovable to Hephaestus, and displeasing to Hera, and similarly for any other gods who may differ from one another on the matter. So that's referring to a bunch of myths. I'm not going to go through those, but Euthyphro responds, but Socrates, I think that on this point at least, none of the gods do differ, that anyone who has unjustly killed another should be punished. So this is sort of the desperate rejoinder against Socrates' argument, which is to say, the gods do differ on some things, but on some points of more or less objective ethics. Anyone who has unjustly killed another should be punished. None of the gods disagree about this. All the gods are in agreement. But Socrates will tear that to pieces. So Socrates says, is that so? What about men, Euthyphro? You never heard them arguing about someone who was killed unjustly, or done anything else unjustly, should not be punished? Euthyphro, why yes, they never stop arguing like that. Whether in the law courts or in other places, people who've committed all sorts of injustices will do or say anything to escape punishment. Socrates, but do they agree, Euthyphro, that they've committed injustice, and in spite of agreeing, do they still say that they shouldn't be punished? So this is the very interesting point in Plato, that it's considered one of the more consistent ideas throughout all of Plato's thinking. We think, therefore, that it has to go all the way back to Socrates himself, and it's kind of like I'm talking about the historical Jesus here, not to do that, but yeah, but what Plato is pointing out here through Socrates is essentially that people don't argue that if they committed an injustice that they shouldn't be punished. They usually, so then just to go through Socrates in this paragraph, so it isn't just anything that they'll do or say. You see, I don't think they'll dare say or argue that if they act unjustly, they should not be punished. Instead, I think they deny acting unjustly, don't they? That's true, they do. So they don't argue that someone who acts unjustly should not be punished, though they do perhaps argue about who acted unjustly, what his unjust action consists of and when he did it. So this is an interesting point. I have a little note here, which is, this is not relevant to this pod or this discussion. This is more about Plato's Republic, but it's very interesting that this sort of judgment and this idea of Plato's is essentially based on common sense. So it's based on the notion that anybody in their common experience understands that a person trying to justify their actions is typically not doing that by saying that because they were unjust, they shouldn't be punished. They're usually making some form of argument of why their seemingly unjust act wasn't either as unjust or wasn't unjust, period. And so that's what people dispute about. And so this is a point that it seems so intuitive that you just roll along with it. And then I guess this is sort of a development sort of in Christianity of this idea that there are people who essentially commit injustice on purpose, and Plato and Socrates, from an ideological perspective, seem not to believe that. They essentially believe that anybody who commits injustice, or that nobody who committed an injustice would, that somebody who committed an injustice would want to basically be purified by the punishment of it, and that sort of thing. And so therefore, basically, Socrates' reasoning along these lines is nobody chooses to do the wrong thing because the wrong thing seems worse, not just for you, but for everybody else. And therefore, because you don't want to live in a worse world, you don't do that thing. And so that's just an idea that I've personally come to dispute, because I think there are plenty of people who commit injustice and then still say they shouldn't be punished. But then I think when you do analyze what they're actually saying, people will rarely ever claim this. I just think it's an interesting idea of, what if there was a tyrannical sort of figure who was able to essentially revel in their personal level of evil and the sort of things that they do, and what the possibilities would be for that, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's a field from this discussion. So just to get back to what Socrates is saying here, Socrates is also sort of pointing out how weird it sounds to say that the gods argue about issues of justice. And so Socrates then says, doesn't the very same thing happen to the gods as well? If indeed they do quarrel about just and unjust actions, as on your account they do, and if one lot says that others have done wrong and the other lot denies it, surely no one, my excellent friend, whether god or human being, dares to say that the one who acts unjustly should not be punished. Yes, what you say is true, Socrates, at least the main point. I think that men and gods, Socrates saying this, I think that men and gods who argue, Euthyphro, if indeed gods really do argue instead about actions. It's about some action that they differ, some of them saying that it was done justly, others unjustly. Isn't that so? So Socrates is pointing out by asking the same question twice in 2 paragraphs that I don't think he believes that the gods really do argue, and he's only willing to consider why they would argue. So it's about some action that they differ, blah, blah, blah. Of course, says Euthyphro, Socrates says, come then, my dear Euthyphro, and teach me too, that I may become wiser. A man committed murder, which, while employed as a day laborer, and died as a result of being tied up before the master, who tied him up, found out from the proper authorities what to do about him. What evidence do you have that all the gods consider this man to have killed unjustly, and that it's right for a son to prosecute and denounce his father for murder on behalf of such a man. Come, try to give me a clear proof that all the gods undoubtedly consider this action to be right. If you can give me an adequate proof of that, I'll never stop praising your wisdom. So, let's see. Yeah, I think we're gonna pause reading new content there. So, as far as today is concerned, I've gone over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've done about 5.5 pages. So that's a good amount of the dialogue. So this is a good point to stop. There's stuff to consider right after this, but just to summarize really quickly, Euthyphro starts getting nervous and wanting to get out of the discussion. Socrates makes very clear to him that he's got all the patience in the world to listen, and Socrates is sort of toying with Euthyphro, and it's funny, but yeah, I mean, I'll just read this from Socrates and then just leave it at that. So Socrates comes up with another definition of piety. Is that now how you'd like us to define the pious and impious? Euthyphro, what's to prevent it? Socrates, nothing on my part, Euthyphro. But you examine your own view, and whether by assuming it you'll most easily teach me what you promised. So Socrates is pointing out to him, you promised to teach me about this, that, and the other, and Socrates is turning the question on Euthyphro. Once Euthyphro has kind of revealed that he doesn't have a precise definition of piety, Socrates then goes to say, well, you don't have a clear definition of piety, and then he essentially recites all the facts of his father's indictment and situation, and says, how do you know that all the gods consider this person? And what he's pointing out here is that this definition that Euthyphro has given, Euthyphro has essentially just thrown a random definition out there because he's doing what philosophers like Descartes and whatnot will refer to as groping in the dark, where he doesn't have real principles, he doesn't have real knowledge, he's grasping at things that are flying around in the void and trying desperately to hold on to something solid enough that he can hang on. And all he's, revealing for the brief periods of time that he gives a definition and that Socrates lets it stand is just that he's a slightly more sophisticated fool than he was a few minutes ago. And so Socrates, again, this is the philosophical method. Come, try to give me a clear proof. If you can give me an adequate proof, I'll never stop praising your wisdom. So I think here, just to go over some of these big ideas that we've gone through in these paragraphs that I think is important. Again, we've gone over the first definition of piety, which is first from Euthyphro, what's pious is what I'm doing. Socrates sort of gently corrects him. What's pious is what's loved by the gods. Go through the definition. Clearly, the gods love different things. Therefore, clearly, the pious, if it's going to be relating to the gods loving it, is about all the gods loving something. And then again, Socrates points out that the gods disagree on things. Therefore, definitions of piety are essentially inconsistent with the Greek traditional religious context. And that's what I think Socrates is essentially in trouble for. So this is ironic on a large number of levels, but we've got that first definition of piety that again gets shot down for reasons of polytheism, but will be shot down further for further reasons once the more sophisticated definitions are considered. But anyway, we've got we've got that, we've got the sort of the hinting towards the respect for mathematical reasoning about measurement, calculations, weighing, and basically the idea that the philosophical method is trying to bring sort of mathematical reasoning to areas that are slightly beyond that purview without applying the methodology incorrectly. So it's just trying to use those sorts of principles of more objective ways of thinking in order to sort of ground yourself and avoid such, plainly subjectivistic opinions such as those that Euthyphro holds, and etc., etc. So we've gone over a good number of things here, so I'm going to pause here actually because I want all these to be roughly 50 minutes and basically figure out how much content goes into a 50-minute pod. So that's all for now. And then next time, just for a little marker here, we're going to pick this up at sorry for the pause. Yeah, we're going to pick this up, okay, we're going to pick it up at 9C. Okay, so that's where I'm leaving off. All right, thanks.